All right, hello everyone, Coach Robert here. Today I want to address a common beginner error, which is giving useless checks. So I can understand why people make this mistake. Probably most people want to feel like they're in control of the position and they're doing something active. They're not being a passive participant in the chess game. They want to do something to improve their chances of winning right away. However, giving checks, just any random check, is not the way to improve your chances of winning. There's something that you can do that's much better. So let me first go into a couple common mistakes for people who have just recently started playing chess. This first example is probably familiar to everyone. One way that a beginner might start the game that's good is with e4, e5, and bishop c4 like this. What's bad is the possible follow-up after knight f6 of giving a check. In this position, white could check the king by playing bishop takes f7. The temptation to play this move is quite strong among many beginning players because you take a pawn, so you're capturing something, you make them move their king, and to many people this looks like a position in which you have some great attacking chances. However, this is not the case, and here's why. The long-term potential of the bishop to attack f7 was much stronger than what you got by sacrificing it right away. If you give up the bishop just to make them move their king, within a couple of moves, they're going to put their king back in a safe position, and they'll just be happily up a bishop for a pawn. That's a pretty considerable material advantage at this stage of the game. Some sample play might be like this. Maybe you try to protect your e-pawn before you go ahead with the attack, and black develops their bishop. And then you play knight f3, intending to go to g5 or e5 to attack the king on f7. Let's say black defends the e-pawn. You give a second check. If this was a 3 checks game instead of a regular chess game, you would be very close to winning. But after king to g8, in this normal chess game, the attack just stalls. We have only 3 pieces developed. We're down a piece. The bishop is still missing. And black has even greater development, and it even looks as if they castled. So there was really no damage done to black's ability to make their king safe with this check. If you find yourself in a position like this, with the temptation to sacrifice a bishop on f7 just to do something active, just to create some chances for an attack, you probably are just desiring a feeling of control, which is quite understandable. But you should replace the thought process of, I would like to check the king in order to gain control with, I would like to develop my pieces in order to get more control of the board so that I can go on the attack later. The weakness f7 is not going away. We can probably bring more force to attack if we play somewhat judiciously. Another way that you can play is with d3. There are lots of different good moves here. Just don't sacrifice the bishop. This check is beyond useless. It's detrimental to your ability to win the game. And this is just one example. Here's another common beginner situation. Frequently, as soon as a check arises on the board, some option to check, people will give the check. So let's say black plays d6. Some people might know that this is the beginning of a famous game by Paul Morphy called the Opera Game. I would highly recommend that you guys check it out. There are many videos and other places to find this famous game online. Now, after d6, many people will ascertain that there's this check possible with the bishop. So again, it's a bishop check. And they'll immediately want to do it. And here the temptation is that, first of all, you're using one of your pieces that hasn't developed yet to check the king. That sounds like the ultimate bargain. Like, we're getting one piece into the game, we're attacking their king. Sounds good, right? The problem is that black has some useful responses. So let's say we do it. We give the check. Their possible responses are knight c6, knight d7. They have 2 knight moves, don't forget that. c6 with the pawn, bishop d7, queen d7, and king e7. These are all the possible moves for black in this position. And 2 of them are horrendous. If they play queen d7, we will be delighted to take the queen, of course, right? We got a huge value. Queen is considered by most people to be like a 9-point piece. The bishop will get captured, but it's considered to be much lower value at 3 points. So it's going to be a great boon for white, no matter how you look at the game. And king e7 is also extremely bad for black, because they're losing their castling rights and their piece coordination is extremely poor. They cannot move their queen or their bishop anymore because the king is just standing in the open. Like, it looks really bad. So it might be very tempting when you look on the bright side of them playing queen d7 or king e7. You'd think that we give a check, they'll probably play a bad move. And even though they have these other moves, bishop to d7, knight to d7, knight to c6, pawn to c6, you might look at the silver lining and say there's a chance, some probability that they will make a bad move. But chess is not a probability game. You have to remember that. This is a game of perfect information. We have complete knowledge of everything that we can do and everything that our opponents can do. And the only challenge in chess is to use your information better than your opponent. So since it's complete information, there's no chance that black will miss that they could make one of these better moves. Even if they make this option, this is perfectly fine. They're attacking the bishop back, and if you trade it, black is just getting more development. Their pieces are coming into the game very rapidly because white is just trading off whatever active pieces they have. But on top of that, black has this great move, c6. And this is a move that you should remember. If you can block a check with an attack on the checking piece, you are going to gain some extra moves. Now, extra moves are not always useful. For example, if you make some pawn moves in front of the king that make the king more weak, then those moves are not the kind that we want to play. But the move c6 is very useful because the move c6 guards the d5 square. That's a center square. All four center squares are very important because the center is the gateway from one part of the board to the other. Control of the center is very vital for a healthy chess position. So if we attack the bishop and it moves again, we can see that black is getting lots of development. And at what price? Basically no price, because white is just moving the same piece again and again. Meanwhile, black is involving the pawn and the knight. So you should replace the thought process of giving random checks with the thought process that you would like to improve your pieces more. So if we go back to this position, there are several great moves here. You could play d4, you could play knight c3, you could play bishop c4. There's like lots of good moves to play here. There's no reason to settle for bishop b5, which is giving free moves to your opponent. Even if you put your bishop somewhere else, like c4, which I said was a good move before, right? Why would you go to b5 and then c4 if you could just directly go to c4? It doesn't make sense. You should not give the extra move. It could be useful to your opponent. Okay, so here's a third example, again from beginner chess play. This one is probably the most tempting out of all of the random checks that we've looked at. So let's say that we play a fairly orthodox opening. This opening is called Italian game, and it's very popular among starting players because it's simple to play, and it's good even when you reach the grandmaster level. So after this move, bishop c5, the hallmark move of the Italian game, let's say that white plays d3, and black plays knight f6. This is one way to play, but not the only way. Many times beginners will play knight g5. The reason they want to play knight g5 is they want to take on f7. And this would be good if black randomly chose a move which doesn't guard the f7 square. One common example of a beginner mistake here is queen e7. And after probably bishop takes f7, king d8, and then bishop b3, not only did black lose their castling and the f-pawn, they also are under attack. The move bishop to b3 is preparing knight to f7 with a fork that could probably net a rook. But even if that never happens, like even if they play rook f8, preventing that idea, this position is very good for white. They ruined the castling, they got more material, and it didn't really cost them anything to do it. So queen e7 is a big mistake, right? So white is banking on this kind of mistake, generally, in beginner play. But after knight g5, it's quite simple to play castling. And when you castle, the rook now guards the f7 square. So this is where the really tempting moment comes in. White has invested multiple moves with the same piece, which is not advisable. You should generally use all of your sleeping pieces, right? So they've invested some time to get the knight to g5, and now f7 is guarded. The next temptation is to initiate a capture sequence on f7, which involves a check. You could start with bishop f7 check, or you could play knight f7, which is maybe a little more cunning. And the idea is that if black makes a bad move, like knight e7, we can do some cool discover checks. Like we could play, I don't know, knight e5 or knight g5. Any move with the knight is check. So we have some options here for attacking their king. Plus we got one extra pawn, so that's usually pretty good. So that's what white's hoping for. But after rook takes f7, bishop takes f7, check, king takes f7, white got to check the king. They initiated some forcing sequence to give themselves a feeling of control in the position. But the end result is that black has many developed pieces. They have a very small king safety problem, which can be fixed in one move with king g8. And white still needs to get all their pieces involved. This is not how an attack on the king should look. This is not a useful check. So another way to look at this is that this is a material loss. I know that knight and bishop are considered 3-point pieces. So if we take a pawn and a rook, but we lose a knight and a bishop, it sounds like it's material equal, right? 6 for 6. But the points are just a guideline. In this position, black has a superiority of development. That's really important. And also, the two minor pieces generally coordinate much better than a rook and a pawn. So it's almost as if white is down material. So this is also a pretty poor example of checking the king. So you should avoid this temptation as well. A better way to play is just to use any of your sleeping pieces. Like you could play castling, that's great, makes your king safe. You could play knight c3, you could play c3, you could play bishop g5, or, there are lots of options here. Even knight d2 is probably quite reasonable. So these are your options. You should develop a piece instead of giving a random check. However, there are times when you should check the king. It's good to see the checks. It's not always good to play the checks. But I'll show one example from when I was a beginner about 10 years ago in which I found some good checks. I was playing black in this game. I would generally not start the game with f4. This is called bird's opening, and it has a rather poor reputation. So I played e5, and this is a gambit, which might not even be the best way to play against bird's opening, but hey, I was a beginner. You can't blame me. So pawn takes e5. White's up a pawn, and so I gave him another pawn. And now I have a couple opportunities to give checks, okay? I actually had a chance to check on the last move here. Instead of playing d6, I could have played queen h4. So you might want to just pause for a second and ask yourself, is this a useful check? I'm going to tell the answer in a second. So you can just pause the video if you're interested in that. This check is not a useful check. It feels good because you're using your queen, which was just sleeping a second ago. You're attacking the king. But when they play g3, this move is useful for white because it gives them some room to develop their pieces, and it controls some weak squares, the dark squares leading to the king. And after you move your queen again, maybe like e4, this is a tempting move. Keep developing those pieces, and meanwhile, you're just moving the same piece again and again. In fact, moving the queen over and over again in the opening is another major beginner error, so I would recommend that you guys not do that. The queen is so high value that usually it cannot escape from danger by trading itself, so it's very easy to attack the queen. For example, if black continues with knight c6, it looks like it's making a threat, but after knight c3, the queen just has to run away. So this is an example of a useless check. So that's why I added in d6 and bishop takes d6. I'm preparing to make the check more useful, and lo and behold, my beginner opponent played b3, which was very helpful to me. So you could maybe pause here and ask yourself, do we have any useful checks here? You might need to anticipate your opponent's reply and see if you have a good move as well in order to correctly ascertain whether or not the checks are useful. Okay, I'm going to tell the answer now. So we have two checks, bishop to g3 and queen to h4. Sometimes a move by itself is not helpful, but in combination with another move, it's good. So it's sometimes useful to identify all your resources. I like to call that candidate moves, all the different ideas that you could have, and then try them out in different orders. So clearly we don't want to play bishop g3 because after pawn takes g3, we lose a bishop for free. That's an example of a bad check. We don't have any useful moves after this. That's why I say this is bad. You could maybe try something like queen g5, but it's a desperate bid for control. I think white could defend against this threat pretty easily. So it's not bishop g3. So let's turn our attention to queen h4. they respond to the check in the same way. Notice that they only have one reply. If you're looking for combinations or tactics, it's usually good to identify situations where there's only one thing to do, as opposed to like 5 things to do in the case of playing bishop b5 in the other example. So here, they have to play g3, and there are actually 2 mate and 2s. I chose queen g3, with the idea that after pawn takes g3, bishop g3 is mate, and this is how the game ended. You could also start with the bishop, whatever you like. The reason that this check is good is that even though it loses a piece, it wins the game. So you always have to keep in mind that mate wins the game. There are exceptions for any way of thinking that you could possibly make to help you in other positions. I always look to see if there's a good follow-up if I'm looking at some kind of check. Like after bishop g3, I didn't rule it out because it loses a bishop. I ruled it out because it loses a bishop and there's no useful follow-up. But queen h4 has a very useful follow-up. It's mate. Okay, so I think this is probably a good taste of some situations where people typically give checks, but they're not useful, and some moves that you could play instead, some developing moves, utilizing your full force, all the sleeping pieces who are still in the back rank, and also one counterexample where we want to give the check, we just need to make sure that it's well timed so that it's not useless. You have to look for good follow-ups and ask yourself, what will my opponent play? Alright, thanks for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you like it, please subscribe, and feel free to reach out in the comment section if you have any questions or requests.